Hello everybody, and my name is Terry Fisher. Welcome to NQA's webinar regarding the migration from 18,001 to 45,001. So just before we start, we'll go through a few technicalities regarding the webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to load them up as we go into the right-hand column there. You can see, you just type them in. And depending on what the questions are, we'll either answer them as we go if they're relevant to the various sections, or there is a question and answer session at the end. Just as a prompt there, I can't answer individual questions for organisations. I can only talk generically about the application of the management system. So I can't give you answers specifically to your own requirements. So, can everybody hear me okay? Can you just somebody just respond and just confirm that you can hear everything fine? Brilliant. Thank you all very much for that. Right, so firstly, let's talk about why implement ISO 45001. What we're looking for is enhanced performance of the occupational health and safety system. We may be looking for a cultural improvement change to drive forward that long-term improvement that may be needed by the business. We're talking about proactive risk management, a systematic approach to reduce culpability, and most importantly, protect the workers, which is the core group that this management standard is aimed at. And it also helps demonstrate a proven commitment in terms of leadership, action, and improvement. And it can fit very nicely into an existing framework of management systems, ISO 9001, ISO 14001, etc. So that's the primary fundamental requirement that we're looking for as to why implement ISO 45001. There is no significant change in the strategic requirements of 45001. I think it's fair to say that all the requirements of 45 in comparison to 18 have been enhanced and written in a way that it fits the new business model within the ISO group of standards. So the structure of 45001, those of you familiar with the revisions to 9 and 14 will be familiar with this basic structure. So the first three refer to the standard itself. So section 1 is the scope of the standard, what it's trying to achieve. Primarily, that's the primary thing that the standard is trying to achieve for the organisation is delivery of policy and objectives in line with strategic and operational direction and continual improvement of performance over time. Section 2 is the normative references which relate to what the standard refers to and the various things, how it links to other standards, etc. Section 3 are the terms and definitions used within the standard, which is an important element to understand. But from an operational point of view and from an assessment point of view, it's section 4 to 10 that we're really interested in. So section 4 being the context of the organisation, 5 leadership, 6 planning, 7 support, 8 operations, 9 performance evaluation, and 10 improvement. So the processes that are required within the management system, as I said, we're looking hopefully to achieve a cultural change and improved OHS performance for an organisation. When we talk about context, we're considering external issues and internal issues, activities and purpose of the organisation. Also within section 4, we've then got to consider who are the interested parties in relation to those internal and external issues and the needs and requirements. The primary one regarding this standard are the workers. Now, we deliberately use the term workers, not employees, because workers covers the whole group, including external agency staff, contractors, and anyone else within the organisation that can be affected by the work activity. So that's why we use the term workers, not employees. There's also the legal and regulatory requirements and the various things the commitments and the comments regarded from those groups and how they can influence what's needed in relation to the organisation itself. And I guarantee you now, every organisation is unique. They may do a similar thing, but it is unique. We then consider in section 5 the strategy, the policy, the roles and responsibilities, and the participation of workers and engagement of workers within those activities of the management system. Section 6 is the planning section where we look at hazard identification, the risks and opportunities which may have been identified as a potential in the context. So when you're looking at external and internal issues, there may be risks and opportunities that are identified there that you may need to then action and consider within section 6. Your compliance obligations and your OHS system objectives. Section 7 and 8 is the support and operation, and it's looking at resources, competence, awareness, communication, and documented information. In this element section of the standard processes, we're looking at the hierarchy of control, change management, procurement, contractor control, and emergency preparedness, as well as the normal operational controls of the activities. In sections 9 and 10 of the standard, we're looking at internal audit, management review, incident and corrective actions, improvement objectives, and process improvement overall. So continual improvement should be a natural output from the systematic activity. So the starting point, we've got to consider what the scope is. So the scope, as far as is applicable to your management system, is consider what you do and why you do it, who the interested parties are and how they can be affected and what their needs and requirements are, and the strategic direction and leadership of the business. What does the business want to do? Which direction does it want to go in? Is it developing new processes, etc., etc.? They need to be considered first before we define the scope of the management system. Because only when we understand those primary requirements on the left can we determine the scope of the system and its applicability. So within the context of the organisation, think about different types of organisations. Could be a water company, is very different from a university, which is an educational establishment, which could be very different from a food manufacturer, or that in itself may be very different from a family-owned engineering enterprise. All these things have very different contexts, but they will be all trying to achieve the same thing when it comes to their workers and their operations. They all want to identify the risk, control those risks, and drive forward improvement and cultural change and worker engagement within the organisation. So the context is a very dynamic activity within the organisation, and understanding that is a bedrock of where you need to start really getting to grips with why do you do things, who do you do it for, and how do you know it's actually been delivered and achieved. As I said, each of the above is very different in terms of its organisation, and its external and internal factors and interested parties could be very diverse depending on the type of organisation, etc. And they are all unique to that one organisation, even though they may be doing something very similar to another organisation just down the road. So within the context of the organisation, we're looking at understanding the organisation. What does the organisation do and why? Understanding the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. In this standard, workers are a core interested party because obviously they're the ones that the system is aiming to protect and reduce risk and exposure to hazard. So workers are the core consideration within this management system, but there will be other interested parties such as business owners, stakeholders, neighbours, contractors, suppliers, a whole range of other things, enforcement agencies, a whole range of other people, other bodies that will have an interest and a need from that organisation. And when you understand what the organisation is and what it does and why it does it and where it wants to go, it understands the needs and expectations of the workers and at least the workers groups and all the various interested parties, then it can determine the scope of its management system. The scope needs to be documented. So as most of you will be aware if you're familiar with 9 and 14, the phrase documented information is used as a standard phrase now within the ISO suite of management systems. That refers to documented information isn't just hard copy documents. We'll talk about that a little later, but it can be anything. So it can be data on spreadsheets, etc., etc. It can be photographs. Documented information is an all-encompassing phrase which is almost limitless. And then there's the actual requirements around the management system itself, which is all defined in section 4. So if we think briefly on the external and internal factors, various companies and organisations may use a pestle analysis to identify those. These are not mandatory requirements. You don't have to use a pestle analysis. However, a lot of organisations find it useful to use a systematic framework such as a pestle analysis. And the internal factors, depending on the organisation, its strategy, its structure, its existing culture and style, the staff, the languages used, whether it's diverse languages, whether you've got communication, diverse communication needs and requirements, the skills, both existing and those potentially needed going forward, the systems and infrastructure of an organisation, and its shared culture and value that exist. All these things have an influence and impact on the management system and its effectiveness. So they all need to be considered within the round of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. If we think of the ISO management standards as a suite of management standards, but equally importantly as business management tools, because they're now sharing, or all three of the core ones for 9, 14 and 45 are all sharing this Annex SL framework, it really makes common sense to apply them as business management tools rather than occupational health and safety, etc., etc. And you can integrate the requirements within the normal business activity, which is the key element there. It shouldn't be, oh, well, we run this operation, and by the way, we do some health and safety or occupational health and safety, or we do some environmental management, and it should be built into the core where the organization operates and develops its own processes. They need to be built into the fabric of the organization, shall we say, rather than just, oh yes, we run the business and then we do a bit of this on the side. To get maximum effect and to get real value from these management systems, they need to be integrated into the operational requirements of the organization. And as I say, with 9 and 14, you might have common things: customers, communities, suppliers, regulators, investors, and employees. On 9, you could be looking at customers, owners, providers, financiers, partners, competitors, various pressure groups, depending on the types of product that you may develop. With ISO 45001, we're talking about workers, including managers, contractors, agencies, regulators, customers, and visiting members of the public are all potentially interested parties within ISO 45001. And the context is a core element of all those 3 management standards. So we talked about scope earlier. You can only define the scope once you understand the context and the interested parties, in addition to the workers' needs and requirements. That's a quick summary of section 4. If we talk now about leadership, the emphasis in this standard, as opposed to 18001, it uses the term leadership, not just management. So this is to enhance the participation and engagement with workers and interested parties. And it is about the leadership, not just the management of, in so much as historically it may have been determined, well, we've appointed an occupational health and safety manager, so therefore it's his role to keep all this thing moving along and doing what it should. This leadership requirement is about the whole of the organisation and the engagement of various levels of that organisation within the effective management system. To deliver an effective management system, it needs participation and input from all levels, not just, well, I've appointed an OHS manager, so it's their role. Yes, an OHS manager can support and help and aid and help identify needs and requirements, but it needs to be built into and integrated into the operational needs and requirements of the whole organisation. Hence the change in phrase from management to leadership. And it can be at all levels of the organisation. As part of those requirements, there's a 5.1 clause, which is now got various clauses been expanded. A to M, looking at the various requirements of what leadership needs to deliver. And within 5.2, there's also then the requirement for the OHS system policy to be documented. So this is a strategic commitment by the organisation and its senior leadership to demonstrate their commitment and the direction of travel for the organisation and what it wants to achieve. You've got to remember that occupational health and safety isn't just about accidents. It covers a wide range of activities, a wide range of needs and requirements in terms of health and well-being. So it isn't just the cut fingers and the direct accidents. It can be occupational health issues in relation to mental health, stress, etc., and the overall well-being of the corporate group. So it's about trying to be preventative rather than reactive, which we'll talk about a little later when we talk about actions. But it isn't just about accidents. Within the leadership clause, there is the requirement for organisation roles, responsibilities and authorities. The phrase accountabilities has been dropped because the senior leadership of an organisation remain ultimately accountable for the effectiveness and implementation. They can delegate various responsibilities and authorities to various people, but they cannot delegate accountability. And that's why the phrase has been dropped from the title in comparison to 18,001. And there was various changes then as the standard was developed. The organisational roles and responsibilities is very important because unless people understand what's required of them, unless they know that, how else can they then know how to deliver that if they don't know it's their responsibility? So it's about clear lines of communication. And I think this is common across any organisation. Clear communication and understanding is very important because it really does impact on the effectiveness of what we do and what we're trying to do. Just to answer a couple of questions that have already come up. One of the questions is, will the slides be shared after the presentation? In answer to that question, yes, everybody who's registered as attendee for this presentation will receive the slides via email. There's a question about a CPD certificate for attending the webinar. We don't issue CPD certificates for attendance, but I will ask our training department whether that's possible for future webinar activity. It may be something that we're able to do, or we can find a way of delivering that if that's a requirement generally across the group. So everybody who registers for this will receive the slides, and the recording of this webinar will be available via our website. So hopefully that's answered those questions. So just going back to the leadership clause then, the other element of that clause after the organisation roles and responsibilities is looking at consultation and participation of workers. This is a really important element of this management standard, because without that engagement, without that cooperation, regardless of how well a management system is written, without that engagement of the workers and the cooperation of the workers, etc., then it'll never be fully effective. You'll never achieve maximum benefit without that strive to deliver engagement and participation of the worker group. The management standard looks at the removal of mechanisms and barriers. It looks at time and resource. So this is all interlinking with the leadership, so they need that commitment, the information, communication and training that may be required, non-managerial participation of the worker group to identify hazards and controls, including involvement in the policy development. As I say, it's about engagement with the whole of the management system. It's taken a long time for this standard to be developed. It's been taking a number of years. And in fairness, I think it's done a really good job in its published version, because it's something that every organisation, regardless of its size or nature, can deploy and use, because I guarantee that every organisation will have its own context, leadership needs, etc. So it really is important that you understand that the leadership element is an important element in the development of this standard. Without good leadership and that commitment, it definitely wouldn't be effective in the long term. So moving on from the leadership, if we look at planning, planning is about hazards, identification of risk, and considering the hierarchy of controls and implementing those to reduce risk and take advantage of opportunity. Most of you will be familiar with hazard and risk identification, but obviously in some organisations what's initially perceived as a hazard or risk can be eliminated, and commercially, by eliminating that hazard, that risk, it may develop into an opportunity commercially for the business. So you could develop something that's new, it could develop something that is commercially gives you an advantage over your competitors, but it's primarily aimed at the protection of workers. But it can also be considered in relation to we're going to invest in new technology because that reduces the overall risk to our workers, etc. And it gives us a competitive advantage because the new system is more effective or efficient in delivering the product or the process or the service. It's about looking at it in the round, as I say, within the whole organisation. Somebody's asked a question regarding top management. Top management are the primary body that's responsible for leadership, but leadership can come from all levels of the organisation. So it may be a team leader, it may be a colleague, it may be someone within the structure of the organisation. That leadership can come from all sources within an organisation. So when we talk about top management, from an accountability point of view, it's their fundamental role to deliver the leadership, but it isn't exclusively down to them from an operational control point of view to deliver leadership on a day-to-day basis. As I say, that could be at all levels within an organisation, depending on its structure, etc. So top management and leadership are linked, but one isn't exclusive to the other. So going back to the hierarchy of controls and risks and opportunities, when we apply the hierarchy of control, as you can see from the slide, elimination is the most effective method. So removing the hazard, the risk, is the most appropriate action to take. Substitution is the next level. Obviously, a hazardous substance, potentially replace it for a less hazardous substance, etc. Engineering controls, the guards and the stops and the various things that you can physically put to prevent people being exposed to the hazard. And the last two, administrative controls. So, well, this is our procedure and you should work this way. This is our safe system of work as documented. It's potentially one of the least effective because people have a tendency to work how they want and not necessarily follow the procedure. And also then we come to PPE. So personal protective equipment is the least effective control when it comes to the elimination of hazards and risks to workers. Hence why, ultimately, PPE is the last line of defence. You should be looking at all the other levels prior to that when you're looking at hazard and risk reduction within the management system. That's often forgot because it can be a quick and perceived as an effective method of, we won't address the overall risk, we'll just issue high levels of PPE or whatever. There's a lot of issues with PPE in relation to it's potentially uncomfortable to wear. You've then got it doesn't suit everybody. Then it relies on the people actually wearing it properly to get maximum effect from it, etc., etc. And it fundamentally only protects the worker, the individual worker. Whereas if that hazard is, let's say, noise, everybody within that area is exposed to noise, so it's only protecting that one individual when you really should be looking at longer term reduction of the noise levels down to a suitable level, for example. So when we're talking about hierarchy of control and the identification and risk reduction, this is a fundamental requirement of 45001. So within the various clauses, in section 6, you've got actions to address risks and opportunities, which will include hazard identification and the assessment of risks and opportunities. And it shall be maintained as documented information, so we need documented evidence of that, not just a statement or a verbal statement, although a verbal statement may lead us to show me some evidence of. It's also important to get workers involved in the identification and the actions of this process. There again, coming back to the effectiveness of the overall activity, when you're actually engaging with the workers, they will have an intimate knowledge of what's required and how it's done, as opposed to a potential perceived understanding of the activity. That doesn't mean to say that the workers are, taking control or anything like that. It's a joint activity between the workers and the structure of the organisation to deliver effective risk and opportunity controls and risk reduction. There's also the determination of legal and other requirements. So obviously there'll be statutory and other requirements. So you've got the statutory obligations, which are obviously legal. Within the UK, there's quite a wealth of legislation surrounding occupational health and safety. And other requirements. So other requirements can include things from the interested parties potentially. It may be that your organisation is part of a group, and it may be a group requirement that you do something. So it's not a statutory obligation that's enforceable in law, but it is a requirement to which the organisation subscribes. And all these things need to be considered and documented so that you can ensure that you're delivering those requirements on an ongoing basis. In 6.2, the system talks about objectives and planning and plans to achieve them, not just objectives themselves. So it's talking about what are your objectives. These primarily need to be based on the risks, activities, strategic direction, the risks and opportunities that we've talked about earlier. Some of these objectives could be a strategic direction. Some of them could be a result of a risk assessment or a known hazard or risk. It could be based on historic performance and data. It all depends on the individual organisation. But as well as setting objectives, which helps to drive the continual improvement activity, you also need to establish plans to achieve them. So it isn't just about saying, I want to reduce the risk of X to the staff. Objectives need to be smart, and there also needs to be, well, how are you going to do that? what you're going to do. You're just going to stand back and hope that it happens naturally, or are you going to put some plans in place, put resources available, etc., and make things so that it can be achieved and measured? And those objectives and plans need to be documented and communicated across the group to other appropriate, relevant, interested parties. So we look at risk assessment. Risk assessment is one of the primary drivers for the management system. And that will link then to the company policies. The objectives should be, some of them may be linked to the risk assessments and the outcome from the risk assessments and the controls. This is where the plan, do, check, act principle comes in. Based on the risk assessment, you may identify some improvements, set some objectives, implement those improvements, review the risk assessments, do the checking, has it delivered the benefit? If not, act to revise that, implement a change, and round the cycle it goes. The plan, yep, I want to reduce the risk. How am I going to do it? I want to reduce that particular risk. I'm going to implement something. Did that action deliver what I wanted it to? Yes, no. And round the cycle it goes. So that's a very simplistic view of the plan, do, check, act process. The main message there is that risk assessment is a core activity to enable you to identify what your priorities are within the management system. In section 7 is the support section. It's centered around leadership and communication, but it also talks about competence, resources, information, training, all can be included in the support section of section 7 of the management system. Competence and training is very important. Some of this may be linked to legal and other requirements. There could be some statutory requirements for competence for people doing particular activities. That information needs to be known, training resources need to be provided, etc. So it's not, when you're looking at a management system, don't look at it as individual, right, I've done risk assessments, right, that's all the elements of the management system interconnect to one another in some way, shape or form. There's a lot of connectivity between the clauses. So it's not a matter of, doing the risk assessments, identifying actions and then just walking away. It's, so what do we need to do? And it's a continual process. And this is what is meant by continual improvement of the system. Training people is an act of continual improvement, because hopefully after training they have gained skill and knowledge of a particular activity that they previously didn't have. Or it could be refresher training, whereby you've refreshed that skill and knowledge to get them back into good habits if things have started to digress when it comes to operational control. Continual improvement, as I say, is almost a natural output of the management system. And if you do everything prior to clause 10 with continual improvement, then, as I say, you shouldn't have to worry too much about it. It should be a natural activity. So within clause 7 and the support functions, we've talked about resources. As I say, we talk about competence, and it applies to external workers. Have you checked that they're competent to undertake the tasks that you're requiring of them, etc. Awareness. So people need to be aware of what they're responsible for and the right that they can remove themselves from work situations that they consider present an imminent and serious threat to life. We don't want to seriously injure someone or have they get killed or whatever because they didn't think they were authorized to go, stop, I'm not doing that, or we're not doing this, or let's move away from whatever. They need to understand that they have that right, and that needs to be communicated. As I say, communication, this has been expanded with the requirements, and it includes external communications and internal communications, and there should be evidence of communication in various ways, shapes and forms. Documented information, there again, can be on a range of media, not just hard copies, and it needs to be suitably controlled. So documented information can also apply to software and media, because you might have software and media that is controlling a process, and that in itself is giving operational safety controls for a particular process or activity. You know, the computer, we press this button and then the computer takes control and does X. Well, you then need to control the versions of that software and ensure that they don't become corrupted, or they are still effective and they still deliver the identified benefit. And it's something to consider in the modern world with all the various bits of technology that more and more now we're relying on central integrated systems to control activities. And it's about making sure that you control those and that software, that information, so it can't become corrupted and ineffective, because that could be a primary control for various things. So documented information can include software and software programs and compatibility, etc., etc. So it's something to consider. In section 8, we're looking at the operations. As I say, there was various developments from DIS 1 of the standard right through to the FDIS. And the organisation needs to plan, implement and control and maintain processes needed to meet the compliance obligations, manage the risk effectively and meet the requirements of the system. Okay, so it needs to deliver the benefit that it was intended. Operational control can be many and varied depending on the type. So in essence, it's a relatively short number of clauses within this section, but it has huge implications. In 8.1, they're looking at operational planning and control. So you need to plan and control what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, etc. Give training, information, assess risks and hazards. The management of change, that's both planned change, whereby, I don't know, it may be a key member of staff is on holiday and their replacement is taking over for a particular, and they could lead a team or whatever, then that could be a planned change where the person's on holiday. Their deputy needs to be suitably qualified and confident that they can perform their duties in that period. It could also be the unplanned changes, people's working practices that change over time. Oh, we've found a way of, we can just change that. We won't do it that way, we'll do it another way. And these working practices can develop over time. Some of them can be very positive. It can be an improvement in risk and opportunity, and some of them can be very negative. It can actually expose workers to unidentified risks and pose threats that weren't being considered primarily. So this is why this is the link back into the risk and operations, looking at review and making sure it's not just a theoretical, well, this is how we think the process is controlled. This is evaluation and checking that your controls are delivering the benefit that it was intended to do. Also under procurement, it covers control of contractors and outsourcing. It's deliberately written in that way in this section because all too often procurement was an activity that was done within the procurement department, and that procurement department may not have understood the requirements maybe of technical competence or statutory competence for a particular activity, or the requirements for particular knowledge and understanding and communication with contractors. They may be driven by other commercial considerations such as time and availability. Whereas in occupational health and safety, it's a far broader consideration. Yes, we may well consider cost and availability, but we also need to consider competence, how they're going to do it, what's the methods of. So this procurement process isn't limited to procurement departments. It's about linking the activity to the selection and recruitment of contractors and outsourcing activities. And it's making those connections in relation to the operations. The next element of 8.2 is emergency preparedness and response. This obviously relates to not just normal situations that you may identify with your risks and opportunities, but both abnormal and emergency situations that may arise. Most workplaces, I would suggest, may have some first aid arrangements and fire precaution arrangements. Hopefully, you'll never have to use them in anger. However, somebody's considered them as a potential and put resources and controls in place within the workplace. This, depending on the organisational activity, needs to be expanded for everything that's reasonably practicable. You know, it's about taking a common sense approach to what could arise, how could things go wrong, what if there is a serious incident, how would we deal with it, how would we get access to can we get site access to the emergency services, can various things respond, thinking about what can go wrong and have we got suitable control to be able to minimise the impact of that emergency situation. The management system looks at emergency response, but its core activity is to prevent that emergency from arising in the first place. But it's also important to consider if things did go wrong, how would we respond? Plans and preparations and stuff should be available as documented information. So it could be as simple as site plans, for example, evacuation routes, information. The scope of emergency preparedness is almost endless depending on your activities and then the processes and the location, etc. Because it may not be an emergency situation that arrives from your activities. Maybe an emergency situation because your location is near another hazardous activity or someone else's issue. But you've got to be able to plan and respond to those reasonably foreseeable situations and give training and test those responses in terms of drills and various things within the emergency system. So in section 9, we're looking at performance evaluation, the monitoring, the measurement, analysis. Generally, there needs to be documented information retained as evidence of that. And also included here is the evaluation of compliance. So within the requirements of the policy, there's a commitment to statutory compliance. Within section 6, there's the identification of applicable compliance requirements, legal statutory stuff. And in section 9, then there is the evaluation of compliance. So the evaluation of compliance is not just having a legal, an up-to-date legal register, for example. It's testing at various times and appropriately within your system that knowledge does not in itself give compliance. It's actually, are the controls that are being applied, are the various things that are being done in relation to that compliance, are they actually working and delivering the legal compliance that's required within the policy and the strategic direction of the business? So the evaluation of compliance is the checking that not just the theory is there and the knowledge, it's the actual operational evaluation of that compliance to prove that it's effective and to prevent you straying from the statutory requirements. The next element I think you'll all be familiar with, the internal audits. This is not new to 18 and 45. It's across all the management standards. The general requirement there to conduct internal audits. This is the verification process to ensure that the benefit is being delivered by the process and the controls and the activity, and that should be planned, and documentation needs to be retained as information and evidence so it can be checked to say and demonstrate to people like assessors, enforcement agencies, etc., that you're doing the necessary controls and they're working. This needs to cut. The internal audits needs to be based as well on the risks and opportunities within the business. So you should apply a risk-based approach to internal audit scheduling and various things. So something that has a high potential of risk should be looked at potentially more frequently than something that has a trivial requirement of risk when it comes to operational controls. And it also includes the management system itself. So internal audits need to cover both the operations and the activities, but it also needs to cover the requirements and the management system itself. And in 9.3, we've got management review. I think most of you will be aware and familiar with the management review. So just to clarify that, a management review of the system is not a management review of the operations. Management review of the system, as required by the standard, is looking at the effectiveness of the system in its entirety and how that's fit and delivering the benefit and the reductions and the various things, how it integrates into the operational controls. It isn't just, oh, this is we have a monthly operations meeting, therefore that's the management reviewing. There are requirements within the management review that are specific to the system because it's looking at the overall effectiveness of the system and how it's being implemented within the organization. And there needs to be documented information so that we can evidence that, so you can demonstrate that that's taking place. So using risk management techniques and the risk assessment approach to various elements of the management system is very appropriate. Section 10, we talked at the initial outset about improvement. So we're looking here about incidents and non-conformity and corrective action. The phrase preventative action has been dropped from all three management standards in the Annex SL framework because it's perceived as the management systems themselves should be perceived as preventative actions. So they've dropped the word preventative from the phraseology of the standard. However, that doesn't prevent you from using it, pardon the pun, and you can use. It's about the effectiveness of the process that we're interested in, not the words necessarily that you use within the management standard. So from your point of view, it's about making sure that you react to non-conformity and incidents and you deliver corrective and improvement actions to deliver continual improvement and risk reduction to workers. That's fundamentally the loop and cycle that the management system goes through. And so whatever phraseology you use, actions need to be identified, implemented, controlled, and where possible, measurable to verify that they've delivered the benefit. So the implementation of an action is not necessarily closure of that action. There needs to be a review of effectiveness for that action to say, yep, it delivered the benefit, I'm happy to close that down. Or we may need to review it again because we thought it would give us this benefit, it isn't quite doing that, we'll have to think of something else. That's the process that you should be using when it comes to corrective actions. So, leadership is very important, as well as risk assessments, to the management system, as can be demonstrated there. Without that leadership and that commitment and that resource availability, and resource, remember, can also mean time and participation, not just, oh, well, we've spent a number of thousands of pounds or that amount of money on a particular activity. That doesn't necessarily demonstrate leadership. So it's about that engagement, that communication, and that commitment to go forward and look at things and improve. The leadership needs to consider all the various things, the internal, external issues, the context of the organisation, the needs of its interested parties. And it should be enhancing performance. It should be delivering the intended outcome, and it should fulfilment and satisfaction of compliance obligations, both statutory compliance obligations and other requirements. So, if you've currently got 18,001 and you may be looking to migrate to 45,001, you may consider undertaking an interim gap analysis. To aid this, NQA provided various bits of document that are available from our website that look at the changes, the terminology, the various things. You could have a formal gap analysis undertaken by people like NQA, so we could come in, as Assessor could come in. This isn't a gap analysis is not a formal part of an assessment process, but a gap analysis is there so that we can look at your management system existing and, as the name would suggest, identify any gaps or weaknesses within your existing system to look at the requirements. So it's basically like a pre-assessment, but it doesn't form part of a formal assessment process. If you've got an existing management system of 18,001 or you require one, then OHSAS 18,001 is applicable for 3 years following the publication of 45,001. So therefore, it will be available and is suitable and appropriate until 2021. March 2021 is when OHSAS BS 18,001 will be withdrawn and fully replaced with 45,001. Some organisations may be so far down the road of implementing 18,001 that strategically they need to use that time to implement it and then build on it and then transition to migrate to 45,001 at a later period. It depends on the needs of the organisation. So it's still valid for another 3 years, well, 2.5 years from now, until March 2021. However, if you're not committed to 18,001 in terms of resources and structure and various things, and you are considering it, then obviously I would suggest that 45,001 is maybe the most appropriate way and method of adoption, because it's there for the duration. There's no lifespan set on ISO standards, so there isn't an automatic renewal date for various standards. They are renewed or revised as appropriate, depending on the needs and requirements of the industry and the feedback from the various user groups. For example, the ISO 14001 has only been recently revised in 2015. Its previous version was 2004. So just to give you an indication of the potential longevity of ISO standards, they can last a number of years without revision. So don't be frightened of adopting 45,001, because it should be with us for some time. So the practical tips, if you're starting from scratch, I would suggest, first and foremost, have access to and read the standard. That sounds obvious, but I can guarantee there are clients out there that we go in for an assessment process and they haven't. Identify the sources of legal compliance and information, and how you're going to achieve that information, and how is it going to be updated and kept up to date, and link that to the other requirements of the management system and your organisation. Review your existing hazard and risk assessment methodology in relation to the standard. Does it deliver the benefit? And if you need to, as I said earlier, consider a gap analysis to identify the improvement points. It's worth noting there, you don't necessarily need to have an external gap analysis. It can be beneficial for you to do your you can do an informal one yourselves, looking at the various clauses, and it's a review, it's a sense check. Look at that. But there is a great deal of value also in the external one, in so much as getting an external body such as NQA or other providers to come in and look at your system, because we're objective. We can look at it and say the standard requires this, show me that, and it can be reassuring to organisations to get that external verification of identifying the gaps and any needs and requirements going forward. And if you've got an existing OHSAS 18001 system, as I say, read the standard, and by the standard I mean 45,001, either conduct your own gap analysis or have an external gap analysis done to identify the improvement points, and look at the mapping exercise for the management system. What needs to change, how you're going to do that. So, it may be an objective of 45,001 to have a successful migration from 18 to 45,001, and you'll need to plan and resource that appropriately. It's really important that you look at, have available the standard, the terminology used, the linkage between the various clauses. Remember, it's a management system and there's a lot of linkage and connectivity between the various clauses. It's a system that interrelates to the clauses, and they can't just be fulfilled in clause by clause. And you can't be registered compliant with 45,001 unless all the requirements have been fulfilled and met. You can't exclude clauses. You can't say, oh, that's not applicable to us. All the clauses of 45,001 must be applied to your management system. Has anybody got any questions? If so, by all means, type them in now and we'll try and answer them either individually or as a group. There doesn't appear to be Any more questions coming in? I'll just have a double check. So as ever, NQA are here to help and support our clients and potential future customers. So by all means, have a look at our website. You can download various pieces of information. If you need quotes or any other information, then contact us directly and we'll oblige. As I said, there's a wealth of information on our website. The presentation will be issued with the slides. I'll expand the information for some of the abbreviations used just to ensure that they're clear. And thank you all very much for listening. I hope it's been a useful exercise for yourselves, and keep an eye on our website. There'll be more webinars in the future. Thank you for listening.